The rain-lacquered streets of Victorian London gleam like black mirrors under the gaslight, reflecting the trembling shadows of a city wrapped in perpetual mystery. On this particular November evening in 1891, the prestigious Whitmore Museum of Fine Arts stands as a bastion of culture against the creeping darkness outside. The glassy corridors echo with the soft patter of rain against towering windows, while velvet ropes tremble slightly from the draft seeping through ancient stone. Within these hallowed halls, something extraordinary has vanished without a trace. A rare Renaissance masterpiece, valued at more than most men see in a lifetime, has simply disappeared from its secured display. But here's what will keep you on the edge of your seat for the next hour. The only clue left behind is something so ordinary, so mundane, that even Scotland Yard dismissed it entirely. A piece of chewing gum, fresh and pliant, stuck precisely where it should never be. Sherlock Holmes crouches in the sterile-scented gallery, his keen eyes studying this seemingly insignificant evidence through his magnifying lens. The great detective's mind races as he tests a hypothesis with the precision of a scientist, while the sweet synthetic mint aroma cuts through the museum's typical polish and wax. Dr. Watson stands nearby, his steady presence anchoring the emotional weight of what appears to be an impossible crime. The curator, Elise Harrow, paces frantically behind them, her hands trembling as she clutches a ring of brass keys. Her earlier telephone call to Holmes had been desperate, shaken to the core by this inexplicable theft. Meanwhile, Security Chief Bramwell stands rigid and defensive, his pride wounded by the very suggestion that his security system could be breached. Outside, rumors swirl through London's criminal underworld of a phantom collector who strikes without leaving fingerprints, who moves through locked rooms like smoke through keyholes. But Holmes remains skeptically practical, focused on the tangible evidence before him. As thunder rolls softly overhead and footsteps echo through the corridors, our story begins with one simple question. How can a piece of ordinary chewing gum unlock the mystery of an extraordinary crime? Stay with us as we unravel this intricate web of deception, betrayal, and brilliant deduction. Before we dive deeper, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss how Holmes transforms the smallest clue into the key that unlocks everything. In the flickering gaslight of the museum's main gallery, Holmes begins his methodical examination of the scene, while Watson documents each observation with his practiced physician's attention to detail. The stolen artwork, the Madonna of Sorrows by the Renaissance master Benedetto Fontana, had been the centerpiece of the museum's autumn exhibition, drawing visitors from across Europe to witness its ethereal beauty. Holmes introduces us to the key players in this unfolding drama, each carrying their own secrets and motivations. Curator Elise Harrow, her fingers permanently stained with ink from cataloging centuries of artwork, clutches her keys with white knuckles. Her responsibilities weigh heavily upon her shoulders, and the approaching dawn board inspection threatens to destroy her carefully built reputation. Security Chief Bramwell stands at military attention, his starched collar restricting even the slightest movement of his head. When he speaks, his words are clipped and precise, betraying a man who prides himself on absolute control. He insists his security measures are foolproof, yet the evidence suggests otherwise. In the conservation room, restorer Lila Penn works frantically through the night, her cuffs stained with various chemical solvents. Dark circles under her eyes reveal weeks of insufficient sleep, dedicated to preserving the museum's precious collection. She moves with the careful precision of someone who understands that one wrong touch could destroy centuries of artistic heritage. Patron Victor Ainsley arrives fashionably late, wrapped in a plush velvet scarf despite the mild evening. His concern for the missing artwork seems genuine, yet Holmes notices how his gaze lingers uncomfortably long on the donation plaques bearing his family name. His wealth has purchased him influence within the museum's inner circle, but wealth, as Holmes well knows, can also purchase darker services. Night Porter Doyle shuffles through the corridors with the resigned gait of a man accustomed to solitude. His coffee-stained breath and wandering eyes suggest someone who sees more than he admits, yet fears speaking too freely. In his 20 years patrolling these halls after closing, he has witnessed the museum's secrets unfold in the shadows. Holmes maps the gallery's geography with mathematical precision, treating the space like a chessboard where every move must be calculated. The main gallery offers multiple sightlines to the glass skylight above, while security cameras create overlapping fields of surveillance. Yet Holmes discovers a critical blind spot between two camera arcs, a space just large enough for someone to work undetected. The freight corridor leading to the conservation room reveals its own secrets under Holmes's scrutiny. A service stair provides access to the rooftop, and Holmes notes with interest how the architectural layout creates opportunities for someone with inside knowledge. The physical evidence begins to paint a disturbing picture. The chewing gum, pressed firmly beneath the artwork's display plinth, shows no signs of age or exposure. Holmes's chemical analysis reveals traces that shouldn't exist in a public gallery space. Badge swipe records show suspicious gaps that align perfectly with a mysterious sensor blackout lasting exactly 7 minutes. Most intriguing of all, the mint-sweet odor that still lingers in the freight corridor appears hours after the museum's official closure. Holmes tests the air currents and ventilation patterns, determining that this scent could only have originated from someone moving through the space well past midnight. The first logical shock comes when Holmes examines the velvet rope barrier surrounding the display area. The rope shows a subtle but unmistakable crease at a height inconsistent with normal adult movement patterns. Someone had lifted this barrier, but the positioning suggests either someone unusually short or someone working from an unusual angle. The security alarm system presents its own puzzle. Despite the theft, no alarms triggered throughout the night. The system's logs show normal operation, yet the artwork vanished from its secured case without any electronic record of the breach. Holmes begins formulating theories about how such sophisticated security could be circumvented from within. As the first pale light of dawn creeps through the museum's windows, the pressure intensifies. The Board of Trustees expects answers before their morning inspection, and any failure to recover the masterpiece will result in a scandal that could destroy careers and close the exhibition permanently. Watson observes the human cost of this crisis, noting how each suspect bears the weight of potential guilt differently. Curator Harrow fights back tears of professional devastation, while Security Chief Bramwell's defensive posture grows more pronounced with each passing hour. The stakes continue to rise as Holmes realizes this isn't simply a theft, but a carefully orchestrated plan that required intimate knowledge of the museum's operations, security protocols, and staff schedules. Someone with inside access has betrayed the institution's trust, and time is running out to identify the traitor before the crime becomes permanent. The investigation deepens as Holmes encounters a web of conflicting witness statements that seem deliberately designed to misdirect his inquiry. Curator Harrow maintains she personally sealed all shipping crates at 9 o'clock sharp, following her nightly ritual of ensuring every piece remained secure. However, Night Porter Doyle distinctly remembers observing a late crate being shifted in the freight area well past 10 o'clock, the scraping sound echoing through the otherwise silent corridors. Security Chief Bramwell insists with military certainty that his camera network covered every possible angle of approach to the stolen artwork. Yet when Holmes examines the recorded footage, he discovers one camera positioned to monitor the main gallery shows a suspiciously polished floor patch that gleams differently from the surrounding marble. Someone had recently buffed this specific area, removing potential evidence of foot traffic or dropped materials. The subtext of each conversation reveals layers of unspoken tension and hidden agendas. Holmes notices how Patron Ainsley's gaze repeatedly returns to the donation plaque bearing his family's name, his fingers drumming nervously against his walking stick. Restorer Penn actively avoids any discussion of the gallery's skylight access, changing the subject whenever Holmes mentions the building's upper levels. Most telling of all, Security Chief Bramwell unconsciously fingers a key fob at his belt, a nervous habit that suggests familiarity with locks and access points beyond his official duties. The technical analysis of the chewing gum yields startling results that transform this ordinary object into a sophisticated clue. Holmes's chemical examination reveals crystalline residue consistent with conservation-grade calcium carbonate dust, the type used exclusively in the museum's restoration workshops. Embedded within the gum's surface are microfibers from velvet lining, identical to the material used in the museum's secure transport cases. This evidence suggests the gum wasn't carelessly discarded by a visitor, but deliberately placed by someone with access to both the conservation area and the museum's specialized storage materials. Holmes begins to understand that this seemingly casual piece of evidence was actually a calculated element in a more complex plan. An emotional clue emerges when Holmes notices Restorer Penn nervously patting her coat pocket, checking repeatedly for something hidden within. When she momentarily steps away, Holmes observes a folded note partially visible, with only 2 words legible: "Not again." The phrase suggests this isn't her first encounter with suspicious circumstances, implying a pattern of events that extends beyond tonight's theft. Holmes conducts a practical experiment, reenacting how someone might navigate the velvet rope barrier while leaving the observed crease pattern. His measurements of polish transfer and lint distribution create a profile of the perpetrator's movements, suggesting someone who approached the display case from an unconventional angle, possibly while crouching or using equipment to maintain a low profile. A provisional theory begins forming in Holmes's mind, connecting the physical evidence with the behavioral observations. The gum's placement, the rope disturbance, the camera cleaning, and the witness discrepancies all point toward a coordinated effort involving someone with detailed knowledge of the museum's security vulnerabilities. The investigation seems to reach a false clearing point when all evidence appears to implicate Restorer Penn. Her access to conservation materials explains the gum's chemical composition, her nervous behavior suggests guilty knowledge, and her avoidance of skylight discussions implies involvement in a rooftop escape route. The logic appears ironclad, satisfying even Watson's methodical approach to evidence evaluation. However, Holmes refuses to accept the obvious solution without thorough verification. His examination of Penn's alibi reveals she was indeed in the conservation laboratory during the critical time period, with her presence documented by a time-stamped treatment log for a damaged medieval manuscript. The log shows continuous work throughout the evening, with chemical processes requiring her constant attention and precise timing intervals. Yet even this apparently solid alibi contains a troubling anomaly that prevents Holmes from completely eliminating Penn as a suspect. 1 minute of the treatment log appears mysteriously absent, a gap occurring precisely during the window when the theft must have taken place. The missing minute creates doubt about her whereabouts during the crucial moment when the artwork vanished. Watson documents the increasing tension among the museum staff as Holmes's investigation progresses. Each revelation creates new suspicions and allegiances, with previously trusted colleagues eyeing each other warily. The approaching dawn deadline adds pressure that threatens to fracture the institutional relationships that normally bind the museum community together. Holmes recognizes that the true solution lies not in accepting the most convenient suspect, but in understanding how the missing minute could occur within an otherwise complete alibi. His experience with criminal psychology suggests that the most elaborate deceptions often contain the smallest flaws, and this temporal anomaly may be the key to unraveling the entire scheme. The investigation stands at a critical juncture where every assumption must be questioned, and the difference between guilt and innocence may depend on 60 seconds of missing time. The investigation takes a dramatic turn when Holmes discovers that Restorer Penn's missing minute from the treatment log corresponds exactly to an automated solvent filter cleaning cycle in the conservation equipment. This mechanical process runs independently of human oversight, triggered by chemical sensors that monitor air quality in the restoration workspace. During this specific minute, the biometric security switch confirms Penn's presence was required to initiate the automated sequence, making her physical presence in the conservation room an absolute certainty. Holmes realizes he has been methodically led toward a false conclusion, manipulated by someone who understood exactly how a logical investigator would interpret the available evidence. The placement of clues pointing toward Penn wasn't accidental oversight, but calculated misdirection designed to protect the true perpetrator while the trail grew cold. This revelation shifts Holmes's entire interpretive framework for understanding the crime. If Penn was definitively innocent despite appearing guilty, then someone else possessed both the knowledge to frame her convincingly and the access to plant evidence in her workspace. The perpetrator demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the conservation processes, security protocols, and Holmes's own investigative methods. A new pattern of antagonism emerges as Holmes discovers additional evidence of deliberate evidence manipulation. Someone had systematically cleaned the camera mounting rails with a citrus-based solvent, creating a subtle film that distorted the motion detection capabilities without completely disabling the recording function. This technique required technical knowledge of the security system's optical sensors and access to industrial cleaning supplies. The investigation takes on a more dangerous dimension when Holmes learns that one of the museum's night staff received a silent telephone threat after speaking with him earlier. The caller provided no words, only the sound of breathing, followed by a deliberate hang-up, but the message was unmistakably clear. Cooperation with the investigation would have consequences. This intimidation tactic suggests the perpetrator remains within the museum's social circle, monitoring Holmes's progress and identifying potential witnesses. Holmes re-examines the transversal mint scent that had initially seemed to implicate Penn's conservation workspace. With her innocence established, this evidence now points toward a completely different staging area within the museum complex. The scent trail leads not to the restoration laboratory, but toward a forgotten storage room beneath the main staircase, a space that appears on no official floor plans, but provides discreet access to multiple gallery levels. Watson observes how this reversal affects the emotional dynamics among the museum staff. Curator Harrow displays visible relief tinged with guilt, realizing how quickly she had accepted Penn's apparent culpability without demanding stronger proof. Her faith in her colleague had wavered under pressure, revealing the fragility of professional relationships when institutional survival is threatened. Security Chief Bramwell's defensive posture hardens further as Holmes's investigation eliminates the convenient suspect and returns focus to the security system's vulnerabilities. His military bearing becomes more pronounced, shoulders squared against implied criticism of his protective protocols. Each question about camera angles and access controls feels like a personal attack on his professional competence. Patron Ainsley's superficial sympathy begins curdling into impatience as the investigation extends beyond the comfortable resolution of blaming a museum employee. His repeated glances toward the exit suggest eagerness to distance himself from an increasingly complex situation that might expose uncomfortable connections between his patronage and the museum's financial pressures. Most significantly, Restorer Penn's anger emerges now that she's cleared of suspicion. But her fury masks a deeper fear that Holmes recognizes immediately. Her relief at vindication is overshadowed by terror at realizing someone had systematically constructed evidence to destroy her career and reputation. The violation of trust cuts deeper than any financial loss, representing a betrayal of the collaborative spirit essential to museum operations. Holmes restructures his investigative approach, recognizing that his initial methodology had been anticipated and countered by a sophisticated adversary. Rather than following obvious evidence trails, he begins implementing seemingly routine requests designed to observe micro-reactions and unconscious behaviors among the remaining suspects. The detective institutes a harmless-seeming routine lint check of all staff clothing, ostensibly to identify fibers that might help trace the artwork's path through the building. This procedure allows him to examine fabrics, hands, and shoes for traces of the specialized materials found in the chewing gum evidence, while observing how each person responds to physical scrutiny. Holmes also begins paying closer attention to the psychological profiles of the remaining suspects, particularly focusing on how each person's personality traits might align with the methodical planning and bold execution required for this crime. The theft demonstrated both meticulous preparation and calm confidence during execution, suggesting someone comfortable with calculated risks and detailed contingency planning. The reversal forces Holmes to confront the possibility that he's dealing with a criminal mind that anticipated his investigative methods and prepared countermeasures accordingly. This opponent understood not only the museum's physical vulnerabilities, but also the logical processes Holmes would use to analyze the evidence, creating a more intellectually challenging adversary than initially apparent. The revelation of Restorer Penn's innocence sends ripple effects throughout the museum's tight-knit community, exposing the fragile nature of trust within institutional relationships. Holmes observes these human reactions with the same analytical precision he applies to physical evidence, understanding that emotional responses often reveal more truth than deliberate statements. Curator Harrow's relief at Penn's vindication comes wrapped in layers of guilt-tinged shame. She had allowed institutional pressure and personal fear to override her confidence in a colleague she had worked alongside for 7 years. Her hands shake slightly as she realizes how quickly she had accepted Penn's apparent guilt without demanding the thorough investigation that ultimately cleared her. The weight of this betrayal, however brief, will require repair work that extends far beyond solving the current crisis. Security Chief Bramwell's defensive posture calcifies into something approaching hostility as Holmes's investigation returns focus to the sophisticated security breach that made the theft possible. His military training had taught him that defensive positions require constant vigilance, But the elimination of the obvious suspect feels like renewed assault on his professional competence. Each question about camera maintenance schedules and access control logs strikes him as personal criticism, disguised as investigative necessity. Patron Ainsley's carefully maintained facade of concerned sympathy begins deteriorating as the investigation's complexity threatens to expose connections he prefers to keep private. His impatience manifests in subtle ways, consulting his pocket watch more frequently, shifting his weight from foot to foot, and allowing his gaze to linger on the exit doors. Holmes recognizes these behaviors as indicators of someone with scheduled obligations that conflict with extended police inquiry. Restorer Penn's anger burns with the intensity of violated trust, but Holmes detects an underlying current of fear that suggests her involvement in this situation extends beyond being an innocent scapegoat. Her fury at the systematic construction of false evidence against her is genuine, yet her terror seems disproportionate to the threat of professional embarrassment. Someone had invested considerable effort in framing her specifically, implying personal knowledge of her vulnerabilities and past experiences. Holmes adjusts his investigative strategy, abandoning the linear approach that had been anticipated and countered by his sophisticated adversary. Instead of following obvious evidence trails, he begins implementing what appears to be routine administrative procedures designed to observe unconscious reactions and behavioral patterns among the remaining suspects. The detective's request for a comprehensive, routine lint examination of all staff clothing serves multiple purposes beyond fiber analysis. While ostensibly searching for traces of velvet lining or conservation dust, Holmes actually observes how each person responds to physical scrutiny. Guilty parties often reveal themselves through micro-expressions and involuntary physical reactions when subjected to detailed examination. During these individual examinations, Holmes notices that Security Chief Bramwell displays particular tension when the lint collection focuses on his shoes and trouser cuffs. His breathing becomes slightly more controlled, and his military bearing intensifies as if preparing for inspection by a superior officer. These subtle changes suggest familiarity with evidence-gathering procedures that extends beyond normal security protocols. Holmes also begins analyzing the psychological profiles more deeply, focusing on how each person's established personality traits might align with the planning and execution requirements for this particular crime. The theft demonstrated both meticulous preparation spanning possibly weeks or months, and calm confidence during a high-pressure execution window lasting only minutes. This combination suggests someone comfortable with calculated risks and detailed contingency planning. The detective's attention turns increasingly toward Security Chief Bramwell's need for control and systematic approach to problem-solving. Military training creates habits of thorough preparation and contingency planning that could serve criminal purposes as effectively as legitimate security operations. Bramwell's intimate knowledge of the museum's protective systems would allow him to identify vulnerabilities invisible to outside observers. Holmes institutes additional seemingly innocent procedures designed to test specific hypotheses about the crime's execution. He requests updated floor plans showing all service corridors and storage spaces, ostensibly to ensure complete coverage in future security assessments. This mapping exercise allows him to observe who demonstrates unexpected familiarity with spaces beyond their official responsibilities. The detective also begins casual conversations about rooftop access and maintenance schedules, monitoring how different staff members respond to discussions of the building's upper levels. Someone had used the skylight area as part of their escape route, requiring knowledge of structural access points and weather-resistant storage capabilities that wouldn't be common among all museum personnel. Watson documents the psychological toll this extended investigation places on everyone involved. The approaching dawn deadline creates pressure that threatens to fracture relationships and expose secrets that normally remain buried beneath professional courtesy. Each hour that passes without resolution increases the likelihood that careers will be destroyed and institutional trust permanently damaged. Holmes recognizes that his adjusted approach must balance thorough investigation with the human cost of prolonged suspicion. The true perpetrator benefits from every minute of delay and confusion, while innocent parties suffer from continued scrutiny and doubt about their colleagues' trustworthiness. The investigation has evolved into a more complex psychological chess match where understanding human motivations becomes as important as analyzing physical evidence. As dawn approaches with unforgiving persistence, Complications multiply beyond the immediate theft investigation. Holmes uncovers a web of interconnected relationships and financial pressures that transform the museum from a cultural sanctuary into a battlefield of competing interests and desperate motivations. Rumors filtering through London's shadowy antiquities market reveal disturbing information about patron Ainsley's financial circumstances. Sources whisper of mounting gambling debts accumulated at exclusive gentlemen's clubs, where Victorian society's elite wager sums that exceed most annual incomes. These obligations have apparently reached a critical threshold, with creditors demanding immediate satisfaction through any means necessary. More troubling still, Holmes learns that the Madonna of Sorrows was scheduled to be loaned privately to Ainsley's personal salon within the month, a transaction that would have removed the painting from public scrutiny for an indefinite period. This convenient arrangement would have provided perfect cover for permanent disappearance, as private loans between patrons and institutions often operate with minimal documentation and oversight. The investigation faces mounting institutional obstacles as trustees demand the museum reopen for its scheduled morning exhibition. Representatives from insurance companies arrive to assess potential liability claims, while reporters from London's scandal sheets begin congregating outside the building, drawn by rumors of security failures and missing masterpieces. Each minute of delay increases the likelihood that this crisis will explode into a public relations catastrophe that destroys reputations across the art world. Resources grow increasingly thin as Holmes requires additional time for his methodical investigation, while external pressures demand immediate resolution. The museum's board threatens to terminate the inquiry and report the theft to Scotland Yard if satisfactory progress isn't demonstrated within hours. Holmes recognizes that official police involvement would complicate his investigation while potentially allowing the true perpetrator to escape during the jurisdictional transition. A frustrating red herring emerges when Holmes discovers that a junior docent, Margaret Whitley, maintains a habitual chewing gum consumption that initially appears to connect her to the primary physical evidence. Her nervous disposition and recent financial struggles create a compelling profile for someone who might attempt desperate measures to solve personal problems. However, detailed investigation reveals that Whitley's preferred gum brand differs chemically from the evidence sample, lacking the specific mint flavoring and synthetic sweeteners found at the crime scene. More definitively, her work schedule ended 3 hours before the mint scent appeared in the freight corridor, creating an insurmountable timeline discrepancy that eliminates her as a viable suspect. The elimination of this false lead forces Holmes to confront the possibility that the gum evidence was planted specifically to misdirect the investigation toward museum employees with known financial pressures. Someone with intimate knowledge of staff personal circumstances had calculated which individuals would appear most suspicious under scrutiny. Holmes begins recognizing patterns in how evidence has been deliberately arranged to implicate specific categories of suspects while protecting others. The initial focus on Restorer Penn, followed by suspicion toward the junior docent, suggests a systematic effort to direct blame toward museum employees rather than patrons or security personnel with greater access and resources. Dr. Watson observes the toll this extended investigation places on everyone involved, noting how prolonged suspicion erodes the collaborative relationships essential for institutional functioning. Staff members who normally work together seamlessly now eye each other warily, wondering which colleagues might harbor criminal intentions or hidden financial desperation. The approaching gala walkthrough scheduled for pre-dawn hours adds another layer of pressure, as failure to resolve the crisis before public scrutiny will transform a private security matter into a scandalous public failure. Distinguished visitors expected to attend the morning exhibition include members of Parliament, foreign dignitaries, and prominent collectors whose confidence in the museum's security directly affects its future funding and reputation. Holmes realizes that time constraints may be working in the perpetrator's favor, creating pressure for hasty conclusions that overlook subtle evidence or logical inconsistencies. The criminal had likely anticipated this timeline pressure and designed their scheme to benefit from investigative shortcuts driven by institutional panic. The detective also recognizes that solving this case requires understanding not just what happened during the theft, but why this particular artwork was selected and how the timing coordinated with external factors like Ainsley's debt obligations and the scheduled private loan. These connections suggest a conspiracy involving multiple parties with different but complementary motivations. As Holmes delves deeper into the museum's financial relationships and patron obligations, he uncovers a complex ecosystem where cultural institutions depend on wealthy benefactors, whose own circumstances may be less stable than their public reputations suggest. The intersection of financial desperation and institutional access creates opportunities for sophisticated crimes that exploit trust relationships built over years of seemingly legitimate interaction. The investigation has evolved beyond simple theft into an examination of how social and economic pressures can corrupt even the most respected cultural institutions, transforming spaces dedicated to preserving human artistic achievement into venues for betrayal and criminal enterprise. In the pre-dawn shadows of the conservation laboratory, Holmes witnesses a moment of profound vulnerability when Restorer Penn finally confides the true source of her terror. Her voice barely above a whisper, she reveals that 3 years prior, she was involved in a similar investigation at the British Museum, where a colleague was falsely accused of theft and subsequently destroyed professionally, despite eventual vindication that came too late to save his career or reputation. Penn's hands tremble as she describes watching a respected conservator become an industry pariah based on circumstantial evidence and institutional panic. The experience taught her that innocence provides little protection against systematic character assassination, especially when cultural institutions face threats to their public standing. Her current fear extends beyond personal consequences to encompass the safety of her entire restoration team, junior apprentices whose careers would be destroyed by association with scandal. Holmes faces a profound ethical dilemma as Penn begs for protection not just for herself, but for the 3 young conservators working under her supervision. These apprentices have invested years in specialized training and depend entirely on their mentor's reputation for future opportunities in London's competitive art restoration community. Their innocence is absolute, yet guilt by association could end their careers before they truly begin. The detective must balance his commitment to methodical investigation with the very real human costs of prolonged suspicion and institutional panic. Every hour of continued uncertainty increases the likelihood that innocent people will suffer permanent professional damage, regardless of the case's eventual resolution. Holmes understands that justice delayed can become justice denied, particularly in fields where reputation and trust form the foundation of professional relationships. Dr. Watson documents this emotional complexity with his characteristic empathy, recognizing how Holmes's legendary detachment becomes strained when confronted with the collateral damage of criminal investigation. The doctor observes subtle changes in his friend's demeanor, increased tension in his shoulders, longer pauses between deductive leaps, and occasional moments of uncharacteristic uncertainty about the wisdom of pursuing absolute truth, regardless of consequences. An intimate conversation between Holmes and Penn reveals the deeper psychological impact of being systematically framed for a crime she didn't commit. Beyond fear for her career, she experiences a profound violation of trust that extends to questioning her judgment about colleagues and institutional relationships. Someone she worked alongside, shared professional confidences with, and possibly considered a friend had coldly calculated her destruction as acceptable collateral damage. Penn's confession about the "not again" note explains its significance. She had written those words after receiving news about her former colleague's suicide 6 months after his professional destruction at the British Museum. The phrase represents her terror that history might repeat itself, claiming another innocent victim to protect the truly guilty party. Holmes learns that the previous case involved similar patterns of evidence manipulation and false accusation, suggesting the possibility of a serial offender who exploits institutional vulnerabilities across London's museum community. This revelation transforms the current investigation from an isolated incident into part of a larger pattern of sophisticated cultural crimes that destroy lives while protecting the perpetrator's identity. The detective also discovers that Curator Harrow carries her own burden of guilt related to the previous incident. She had served on the investigative committee that initially accepted the false evidence against Penn's colleague, and her current willingness to suspect Penn represents a repeat of the same institutional failure that contributed to an innocent man's destruction. This historical context explains the complex emotional undercurrents Holmes has observed throughout the investigation. The museum staff's nervous energy stems not just from current crisis, but from traumatic memories of watching a colleague's life systematically destroyed while they remained powerless to prevent the institutional machinery of accusation and professional exile. Holmes recognizes that solving this case requires not just identifying the immediate perpetrator, but understanding the systemic vulnerabilities that allow cultural institutions to become weapons against their own staff members. The criminal has exploited not just security systems and access protocols, but the psychology of institutional panic and the willingness of respected organizations to sacrifice individuals to protect their broader reputation. The emotional stakes intensify as Holmes realizes that failure to identify the true perpetrator quickly will likely result in another innocent victim being destroyed to satisfy public demand for accountability. The approaching deadline creates pressure for someone to be blamed, regardless of actual guilt, transforming the investigation into a race against institutional self-preservation instincts. Penn's plea for protection forces Holmes to confront limitations in his traditional investigative approach. While his methods excel at uncovering truth through logical analysis, they often fail to account for the time-sensitive nature of reputation and career destruction in professional communities where perception becomes reality regardless of eventual facts. The detective must somehow accelerate his investigation without compromising thoroughness, recognizing that the human cost of this crime extends far beyond the monetary value of stolen artwork. The true damage lies in the systematic exploitation of trust relationships and the potential destruction of innocent lives to protect criminal enterprise disguised as cultural patronage. Holmes's investigation reaches a critical turning point when he identifies a disturbing pattern in the physical evidence that reveals the crime's sophisticated planning and execution. The seemingly random placement of chewing gum throughout the museum follows a calculated geometric pattern, with each piece positioned at precisely the same low height relative to display fixtures, creating what appears to be a systematic marking system for navigation in low-light conditions. The detective's meticulous examination of gallery fixtures reveals micro-scratches along the edges of multiple display plinths, marks consistent with the careful placement and removal of wheeled equipment. The scratches follow identical patterns across different galleries, suggesting someone had practiced these movements repeatedly to achieve the precision required for silent operation during the theft window. Most revealing of all, Holmes discovers granules of distinctive roofing grit embedded in the stairwell carpet fibers, traced in a pattern leading from the main gallery toward the upper levels. This material matches samples he collects from the museum's rooftop access areas, confirming his theory about the escape route while providing evidence of recent traffic between the theft location and external exit points. The investigation takes a shocking turn when Holmes orchestrates a controlled experiment to test his emerging theory. He arranges for a decoy frame containing a reproduction painting to be temporarily moved from the conservation area, ostensibly for routine cleaning. During this 10-minute window, someone with unauthorized access moves the frame from its designated location and returns it with subtle but detectable changes to its hanging position. This brazen action occurs despite the heightened security awareness following the primary theft, demonstrating that the perpetrator possesses not only detailed knowledge of museum protocols, but also the confidence to continue operating under direct scrutiny. The micro-adjustments to the frame's positioning suggest someone testing Holmes's observational capabilities while asserting their continued control over the situation. Holmes realizes he's engaged in a psychological chess match with an opponent who views the detective's investigation as an intellectual challenge rather than a serious threat. This criminal demonstrates both the technical skills necessary for sophisticated art theft and the psychological profile of someone who enjoys outsmarting authority figures through careful planning and bold execution. The pressure intensifies dramatically as the pre-dawn gala walkthrough looms only hours away. Distinguished guests, including foreign ambassadors, prominent collectors, and members of parliament, expect to view the exhibition's centerpiece, creating a public relations crisis that will expose the museum's security failures to international scrutiny. The insurance implications alone threaten the institution's financial survival, while the reputational damage could permanently destroy relationships with donors and lending institutions. Holmes observes how this timeline pressure affects different suspects in revealing ways. Curator Harrow's anxiety reaches near panic levels as she contemplates explaining the loss to distinguished visitors, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she rehearses potential statements to minimize institutional damage. Her fear focuses primarily on preserving the museum's reputation, rather than recovering the actual artwork, suggesting priorities that might make her vulnerable to manipulation. Security Chief Bramwell's military bearing becomes increasingly rigid as the deadline approaches, his responses to Holmes's questions growing more clipped and defensive. His professional identity depends entirely on his ability to protect the institution's assets, and public failure in front of international dignitaries represents not just career destruction, but personal humiliation on a scale that would follow him throughout his remaining years. Patron Ainsley's behavior becomes more erratic as dawn approaches, his earlier composed demeanor dissolving into nervous energy that manifests in constant movement and repeated checking of his pocket watch. His financial obligations apparently operate on similar deadlines, creating pressure for resolution that extends beyond the immediate museum crisis into his broader social and economic circumstances. Holmes begins implementing what he privately terms the soft trap, strategically placing a fresh piece of gum marked with nearly invisible ash powder in locations where the perpetrator might encounter it during any continued criminal activity. This bait creates opportunities to tag hands, clothing, or equipment with trace evidence that would be difficult to explain away if discovered during routine examination. The detective also arranges for subtle modifications to the museum's environmental conditions, adjusting lighting levels and ventilation patterns to enhance his ability to detect movement and trace evidence while potentially creating psychological pressure on someone monitoring the investigation's progress. These changes appear routine to casual observers but create advantages for someone who understands their purpose. Watson documents the escalating tension among all parties as the investigation approaches its climax. The combination of time pressure, public scrutiny, and unresolved suspicion creates an atmosphere where rational decision-making becomes increasingly difficult, and emotional reactions may override careful planning. Holmes recognizes that his opponent has demonstrated remarkable patience and planning capabilities, but the approaching deadline creates pressure that may force hasty actions or reveal previously hidden aspects of their criminal methodology. The next few hours will determine whether sophisticated planning can withstand the psychological pressure of imminent exposure and public accountability. The investigation's complexity deepens as Holmes connects seemingly disparate threads into a coherent pattern that reveals the crime's true scope and sophistication. The relationship between Patron Ainsley's mounting gambling debts and the museum's lending policies creates a framework for understanding how legitimate cultural transactions could provide cover for permanent art theft, disguised as temporary loans. Holmes discovers that Ainsley's debts to exclusive gambling establishments have reached approximately £12,000, a sum that exceeds his liquid assets but falls well within the insurance valuation of the Madonna of Sorrows. The timing of his debt obligations aligns suspiciously with the planned private loan of the stolen artwork, suggesting coordination between financial pressure and criminal opportunity that goes beyond mere coincidence. However, executing such a sophisticated theft requires logistical support that extends beyond Ainsley's capabilities as a patron with limited physical access to secured areas. Holmes recognizes that while Ainsley possesses compelling motives and the cultural connections necessary to arrange private sales, he lacks the technical knowledge and institutional access required to circumvent the museum's security systems without assistance. Security Chief Bramwell emerges as the perfect complement to Ainsley's needs, possessing comprehensive knowledge of protective protocols, camera blind spots, and staff scheduling patterns. His military background provides the tactical planning skills necessary for coordinating complex operations under time pressure, while his official position grants access to areas and information that would be impossible for outsiders to obtain. The connection between these two men extends beyond their official museum relationships into shared social circles, where military officers and wealthy patrons interact regularly. Holmes uncovers evidence of their mutual membership in the Whitehall Officers Club, where Bramwell's service record and Ainsley's family wealth create natural bonds of class and professional respect that could evolve into criminal partnership. Holmes finally eliminates the junior docent Margaret Whitley as a suspect when chemical analysis confirms her chewing gum preference differs significantly from the crime scene evidence. Her preferred brand contains peppermint rather than spearmint flavoring and lacks the synthetic sweeteners found in the planted evidence. More conclusively, her work shift ended at 6 o'clock in the evening, 3 hours before the distinctive mint scent appeared in the freight corridor around 9 o'clock. This elimination of an obvious suspect forces Holmes to reconsider the sophistication of the evidence placement strategy. Someone with detailed knowledge of staff personal habits and financial circumstances had calculated exactly which employees would appear most suspicious under investigation, creating multiple layers of misdirection designed to protect the true conspirators while the trail grew cold. The detective begins mapping the logistics required for successful execution of this crime, recognizing that multiple specialized capabilities had to coordinate seamlessly during a narrow window of opportunity. The perpetrators needed knowledge of security systems, access to conservation materials, familiarity with rooftop architecture, and connections to underground art markets capable of handling stolen masterpieces discreetly. Holmes prepares his most sophisticated trap yet, using his understanding of the criminal partnership to create pressure that will force revealing actions. He arranges for carefully controlled information to reach different suspects through separate channels, creating opportunities to observe who responds with knowledge they shouldn't possess and who demonstrates coordination with other parties under surveillance. The trap involves planting rumors about fictional evidence discoveries through different museum staff members, then monitoring communication patterns to identify who shares information with whom and how quickly sensitive details spread through various networks. This technique allows Holmes to map the relationships and trust levels among suspects while potentially forcing the criminals to reveal their coordination methods. Dr. Uku. Watson observes how the investigation's complexity creates psychological pressure on everyone involved, innocent and guilty alike. The web of suspicion and observation makes normal interactions impossible, with every conversation potentially containing hidden significance and every gesture subject to interpretive analysis that transforms colleagues into suspected adversaries. Holmes also recognizes that his opponents have demonstrated remarkable patience and planning capabilities, but the approaching dawn deadline creates pressure that may override their careful preparation. Criminal partnerships often fracture under extreme stress, with individual survival instincts overriding collective planning and mutual protection agreements. The detective's strategy focuses on exploiting the natural tensions between conspirators with different motivations and risk tolerances. Ainsley's desperation stems from financial obligations with potentially violent consequences, while Bramwell's concerns center on professional reputation and career preservation. These differing priorities create opportunities for strategic pressure that might force one partner to protect himself at the other's expense. Holmes understands that sophisticated criminal partnerships require constant communication and coordination to maintain operational security. The approaching crisis creates multiple opportunities for interception of signals or observation of meetings between parties who must reconcile their individual fears with collective survival strategies. The investigation has evolved into a complex psychological operation where understanding human motivation and partnership dynamics becomes as important as analyzing physical evidence and timeline reconstruction. Success depends on Holmes's ability to predict how criminal minds will respond to carefully orchestrated pressure designed to force revelation of hidden connections and methodologies. Holmes reaches the culmination of his analytical process, assembling all evidence threads into a comprehensive theory that explains not just what happened, but how, when, why, and with whose assistance. The detective presents his emerging understanding of a sophisticated criminal partnership that exploited institutional vulnerabilities through calculated deception and systematic misdirection. The identity of the criminal partnership becomes clear through convergent evidence pointing towards Security Chief Bramwell acting in coordination with Patron Ainsley. Bramwell's intimate knowledge of protective systems provided the technical capabilities necessary for circumventing alarms and cameras, while Ainsley's cultural connections created opportunities for disposing of stolen artwork through private collector networks that operate beyond official oversight. Holmes reconstructs the methodological approach used during the theft, recognizing the calculated sophistication of each element. The perpetrators used strategically placed chewing gum as temporary fulcrums to stabilize wheeled display plinths during careful movement, allowing silent repositioning of heavy fixtures without triggering vibration sensors or leaving permanent marks on marble flooring. The camera rail cleaning with citrus solvent created subtle optical distortions that interfered with motion detection algorithms without completely disabling recording functions. This technique required technical knowledge of security system vulnerabilities combined with access to specialized cleaning compounds available only through official maintenance channels controlled by security personnel. The rooftop transfer operation utilized the museum's own equipment dollies and velvet-lined transport cases to move the artwork through service corridors during a carefully orchestrated sensor blackout. The 7-minute window corresponded exactly with Bramwell's routine security patrol schedule, providing natural cover for activities that would appear suspicious at any other time. The motive structure demonstrates how Ainsley's gambling debts created desperate need for liquid assets, while his legitimate access to private lending arrangements provided perfect cover for permanent theft disguised as temporary loan. The artwork would supposedly remain in his private collection for scholarly study, while actually being sold through underground networks to anonymous collectors willing to purchase pieces without investigating provenance. Holmes identifies the critical error that reveals Bramwell's direct involvement in planning and execution. During casual conversation about the crime scene evidence, the security chief made an offhand correction, distinguishing between mint and spearmint flavoring in the chewing gum sample. This level of specificity betrays knowledge that could only come from direct handling of the evidence or participation in its placement, since official reports contained no such detailed chemical analysis. The detective realizes the stolen artwork may already be positioned on the museum's rooftop under weather protective covering, awaiting final extraction during the early morning hours when legitimate maintenance activity would provide natural camouflage for removing suspicious packages from the building. Rain creates both challenges and opportunities, washing away some trace evidence while potentially trapping other materials that confirm the escape route. Holmes recognizes that time has nearly expired for preventing the crime's completion. Once the artwork leaves the building and enters London's vast network of private collectors and underground dealers, recovery becomes exponentially more difficult despite knowing the perpetrators' identities. The approaching gala walkthrough creates a firm deadline beyond which the theft transforms from recoverable crime to permanent loss. The investigation reaches peak risk as Holmes realizes his careful observations and logical deductions may have been anticipated by opponents who understand investigative methodology well enough to prepare countermeasures. Bramwell's military intelligence background suggests familiarity with surveillance detection and operational security that could allow him to monitor Holmes's progress while maintaining the appearance of cooperation. Holmes must coordinate his final confrontation carefully, recognizing that premature action could allow evidence destruction or escape, while delayed action might permit completion of the theft during the confusion of morning preparations for the gala event. The timing requires precision that accounts for multiple variables including weather conditions, staff schedules, and the psychological state of suspects under increasing pressure. The detective prepares for what he anticipates will be a direct confrontation by positioning Dr. Watson and trusted museum personnel at strategic locations throughout the building. This coordination allows observation of multiple potential escape routes while providing witnesses for any criminal actions that might occur during the final phase of the operation. Holmes also arranges for discreet notification of Scotland Yard constables to be positioned outside the building, ready for immediate response but far enough away to avoid alerting the perpetrators to official police involvement that might trigger premature escape attempts or evidence destruction. The investigation stands at the moment of maximum tension, where theoretical deduction must transform into practical action. Holmes's reputation for logical analysis faces its ultimate test in a situation where understanding criminal psychology becomes as important as interpreting physical evidence, and where the difference between success and failure may depend on split-second timing and psychological pressure applied at precisely the right moment. The next hour will determine whether sophisticated criminal planning can withstand direct confrontation by someone who understands their methodology completely and has prepared countermeasures designed to exploit the psychological weaknesses inherent in even the most carefully coordinated criminal partnerships. Holmes initiates his carefully orchestrated trap with the precision of a military operation, understanding that success depends on simultaneous pressure applied from multiple directions to prevent coordination between the criminal partners. The detective's plan exploits the natural psychological tensions between Bramwell and Ainsley while creating opportunities to observe their response patterns under extreme stress. The execution begins with environmental manipulation, designed to create optimal conditions for evidence gathering and suspect observation. Holmes arranges for gallery lighting to be dimmed ostensibly for conservation purposes, while actually enhancing his ability to detect movement through infrared observation techniques. The steady rain outside provides acoustic cover for positioning observers while potentially trapping trace evidence that confirms the rooftop escape route. Dr. Watson positions himself in the conservation laboratory with clear sight lines to both the freight corridor and service stairway access points. His medical training provides skills in behavioral observation that complement Holmes's deductive analysis, allowing real-time assessment of stress responses and potential deception indicators among suspects under surveillance. Curator Harrow, despite her emotional state, proves invaluable for monitoring internal communications and staff movements that might signal coordination between conspirators. Her intimate knowledge of museum protocols allows her to identify deviations from normal procedure that might indicate criminal activity disguised as routine maintenance or security operations. Holmes implements a sophisticated psychological pressure campaign by providing carefully crafted misinformation to different suspects through separate channels. He tells Bramwell that forensic analysis has identified specific chemical signatures in the chewing gum evidence, while informing Ainsley that witness testimony has placed suspicious individuals near the freight corridor during critical time windows. The trap's most crucial element involves Holmes's placement of marked bait gum containing nearly invisible ash powder in locations where continued criminal activity would likely encounter it. This creates opportunities to tag hands, clothing, or equipment with trace evidence that would be nearly impossible to explain away if discovered during routine examination procedures. Sensory observation reveals the subtle indicators Holmes anticipated as the trap begins producing results. Footfalls in the freight corridor follow patterns that match the wheeled equipment movement suggested by earlier physical evidence. The soft metallic clink of dolly wheels against stone flooring provides acoustic confirmation of Holmes's theoretical reconstruction of the theft methodology. Most significantly, the faint mint scent that had puzzled Holmes earlier now appears again, cutting through the museum's typical atmosphere of polish and preservation chemicals. This olfactory evidence confirms that someone continues operating in areas where they shouldn't be present, using materials consistent with the original crime scene analysis. Holmes observes Security Chief Bramwell moving through corridors with purpose that extends beyond normal patrol duties, carrying what appears to be a routine maintenance crate but handling it with care inconsistent with ordinary supplies or equipment. The methodical rhythm of his movement matches the systematic approach suggested by the serial physical clues discovered throughout the investigation. The detective's positioning allows him to observe coordination signals between Bramwell and Ainsley that confirm their partnership while providing evidence of ongoing criminal activity. Subtle gestures and timing patterns reveal communication methods designed to maintain operational security while coordinating complex logistics under time pressure. Holmes discovers that rooftop access has been compromised through subtle manipulation of door mechanisms that maintain the appearance of normal security while allowing unauthorized entry. Weather-resistant tarps positioned on the roof shelter what appears to be legitimate maintenance equipment, but could easily conceal transported artwork awaiting final extraction from the building. The trap reaches maximum effectiveness when Holmes observes Bramwell attempting to navigate the marked bait gum locations during what should be routine security activities. The security chief's knowledge of these specific positions betrays familiarity that could only result from previous placement or removal of similar materials during the original theft operation. A critical moment arrives when Holmes must decide between continued observation that might provide additional evidence and immediate intervention that could prevent completion of the theft, but might compromise prosecution prospects. The approaching dawn deadline creates pressure for decisive action, while legal considerations require sufficient evidence for successful criminal proceedings. Holmes recognizes that the criminals have reached the point of maximum vulnerability, committed to completing their operation despite increasing surveillance pressure. Bramwell's military training provides operational discipline, but also creates predictable patterns that Holmes can exploit through strategic positioning and coordinated response timing. The detective coordinates with Dr. Watson through subtle signals that initiate the final phase of evidence gathering and suspect confrontation. Their partnership, refined through years of collaborative investigation, allows seamless coordination without verbal communication that might alert the perpetrators to imminent capture. The investigation approaches its climax as Holmes positions himself to interrupt the final phase of the theft while ensuring sufficient witnesses and evidence documentation for legal proceedings. The next few minutes will determine whether months of sophisticated criminal planning can withstand direct confrontation by investigators who understand their methodology completely and have prepared comprehensive countermeasures. The moment of truth arrives as Holmes prepares to transform theoretical deduction into practical justice, recognizing that success requires perfect timing and coordination to prevent escape while preserving the evidence necessary for criminal conviction. The investigation reaches its zenith as Holmes's carefully laid trap springs into action with clockwork precision, yet unexpected complications threaten to derail the entire operation at its most critical moment. The detective observes his marked bait gum disappearing from strategic positions throughout the museum, confirming that someone continues moving through the building with knowledge of the evidence placement patterns that only the original perpetrator would possess. A shadow crosses the service stairwell window, silhouetted briefly against the pre-dawn sky as someone navigates the rooftop access route Holmes had theorized from the beginning. The figure moves with military precision and confidence, suggesting familiarity with the building's architectural vulnerabilities and weather protection systems that shelter the stolen artwork during its final hours before permanent disappearance. Holmes positions himself at the critical intersection between the freight corridor and main gallery, understanding that the perpetrator must pass through this location to complete the theft operation. However, his careful planning encounters an unexpected obstacle when the rooftop access door mechanism jams at the crucial moment, potentially trapping evidence on the roof while allowing the criminal to claim legitimate maintenance activities. The detective realizes that months of sophisticated planning by his opponents included contingencies for exactly this type of investigative pressure. Bramwell's military intelligence background provided training in operational security and surveillance detection that allowed him to monitor Holmes's activities while maintaining the appearance of cooperation throughout the investigation. Dr. E. Watson's medical training proves invaluable as he observes stress indicators in both Bramwell and Ainsley that suggest coordination under extreme pressure. Ainsley's nervous energy transforms into barely controlled panic as dawn approaches with his gambling debts still unresolved, while Bramwell's military discipline begins showing cracks under the psychological strain of operating under direct scrutiny. A presumed ally's hesitation creates additional complications when curator Harrow balks at providing the access assistance Holmes requires for final evidence gathering. Her institutional loyalty conflicts with personal relationships built over years of professional collaboration, creating moral paralysis at the moment when decisive action becomes essential for preventing the crime's completion. Holmes must improvise his approach when the direct rooftop route becomes unavailable, forcing him to navigate through the blind camera crescent he had mapped earlier in the investigation. This alternative path requires precise timing and coordination with Watson to maintain surveillance while avoiding detection by security systems that Bramwell monitors from his command position. The detective's improvised route takes him through forgotten storage spaces and service corridors that appear on no official building plans, areas where dust patterns and air circulation provide evidence of recent traffic that supports his theoretical reconstruction of the theft methodology. Each step confirms details of his logical analysis while bringing him closer to direct confrontation with sophisticated criminals. Weather conditions complicate the final approach as wind and rain create both advantages and obstacles for Holmes's operation. The natural acoustic masking allows stealthier movement, but also reduces his ability to hear coordination signals between the criminal partners or detect equipment movement that might indicate completion of the theft operation. Holmes discovers that his opponents have prepared multiple contingency plans for different types of intervention, including scenarios that account for investigative pressure applied at various stages of their operation. This level of preparation suggests criminal experience that extends beyond the current theft into previous operations that may have succeeded due to inadequate investigation or institutional reluctance to pursue uncomfortable truths. The detective realizes that Bramwell and Ainsley have reached the point of maximum commitment to their criminal enterprise, where retreat becomes impossible due to the evidence trail they've created and the debts that motivated the original crime. This psychological state makes them both more dangerous and more vulnerable, as desperation may override careful planning while creating opportunities for decisive intervention. A critical moment arrives when Holmes must choose between maintaining surveillance that could provide additional evidence and immediate action that might prevent completion of the theft, but could compromise legal proceedings. The approaching gala walkthrough creates an absolute deadline beyond which recovery becomes impossible, regardless of identifying the perpetrators. Holmes observes coordination between Bramwell and Ainsley reaching fever pitch as they attempt to finalize their operation despite increasing pressure and environmental complications. Their partnership, forged through social connections and mutual desperation, begins showing strain under operational stress that threatens to expose fatal flaws in their criminal methodology. The investigation approaches the moment of ultimate revelation as Holmes positions himself for direct confrontation while ensuring sufficient evidence documentation and witness coordination for legal proceedings. Years of collaborative experience with Dr. Watson allow seamless coordination through subtle signals that prepare for immediate action without alerting the perpetrators to imminent capture. The detective recognizes that the next few minutes will determine whether sophisticated criminal planning can withstand direct confrontation by investigators who understand their methodology completely. Success depends on perfect timing, comprehensive evidence gathering, and psychological pressure applied at precisely the moment when criminal confidence transforms into vulnerable exposure. The climax beckons, as all elements converge toward the final revelation that will either vindicate Holmes's methodical investigation or demonstrate the limitations of logical deduction when confronted by criminal minds sophisticated enough to anticipate and counter traditional investigative approaches. The moment of absolute truth arrives as Holmes emerges from the shadows to confront Security Chief Bramwell in the act of removing a weather-resistant tarp that conceals the stolen masterpiece in a velvet-lined transport crate positioned precisely where the detective's logical analysis had predicted. The confrontation occurs on the museum's rain-slicked rooftop with dawn breaking over London's sprawling Victorian landscape, transforming the scene into a dramatic tableau worthy of the artistic treasures housed within the building below. Holmes presents his definitive evidence chain with the methodical precision that has made him legendary among London's criminal investigators. The fresh chewing gum adhering to the dolly's brake mechanism carries not only the conservation-grade calcium carbonate dust from Penn's laboratory, but also traces of the nearly invisible ash powder Holmes had used to mark his bait evidence. This double contamination proves Bramwell's direct handling of both the original crime scene materials and the detective's recent trap elements. The security access logs provide irrefutable documentation that Bramwell's electronic key fob recorded entries during the precisely timed sensor blackout window when the theft occurred. More damning still, the timing patterns match his official patrol schedule exactly, demonstrating how legitimate security procedures provided perfect cover for criminal activities that would have appeared suspicious at any other time. Physical evidence on the rooftop confirms every element of Holmes's theoretical reconstruction. The velvet-lined transport crate contains the Madonna of Sorrows in perfect condition, surrounded by protective materials that match fibers found in the original chewing gum evidence. Weather-resistant tarps show recent installation consistent with overnight storage operations, while dolly tracks and accumulated rooftop grit trace the exact path Holmes had predicted based on stairwell evidence analysis. Bramwell's fatal psychological error emerges during Holmes's methodical presentation of evidence when the security chief attempts to maintain his innocence by correcting technical details about the investigation that only someone with intimate knowledge of the criminal methodology would possess. His insistence that motion sensors couldn't detect that type of movement reveals understanding of the specific techniques used to circumvent security systems he officially operates. Most devastatingly, Bramwell's correction about mint versus spearmint flavoring in the chewing gum evidence demonstrates knowledge of chemical analysis details that were never included in official reports or witness statements. This specificity could only result from direct participation in evidence placement or consultation with criminal partners who possessed such detailed information about the investigative findings. Holmes's brilliant tactical innovation utilizes London's unpredictable weather as an investigative tool when sudden wind gusts snap one corner of the protective tarp, allowing him to funnel rainwater across the rooftop surface in patterns that reveal footprint evidence preserved in accumulated grit and debris. The water flow traces movement patterns from the stairwell access point directly to the concealed artwork location, creating a visible map of criminal activity that withstands any attempts at denial or alternative explanation. The emotional resolution brings justice for both the immediate crime and the broader pattern of institutional betrayal that had destroyed innocent careers while protecting sophisticated criminals. Bramwell's arrest eliminates the security vulnerabilities that allowed this theft, while potentially preventing future crimes against cultural institutions throughout London's museum community. Patron Ainsley's financial transactions face comprehensive audit procedures that will expose the full extent of his gambling debts and potential involvement in underground art markets. His social position provides no protection against criminal prosecution once his coordination with Bramwell becomes legally documented through communication records and shared operational planning evidence. Restorer Penn and her conservation team receive complete vindication along with institutional protection against future false accusations. The systematic framing attempts against museum employees are exposed as deliberate misdirection designed to protect criminal partnerships that exploited class distinctions and social assumptions about who commits sophisticated cultural crimes. Curator Harrow faces the museum's board of trustees with tempered resolve, armed with comprehensive evidence of external criminal conspiracy rather than internal security failure. Her institutional leadership survives the crisis strengthened by demonstrated commitment to thorough investigation, despite tremendous pressure for hasty scapegoating that would have destroyed innocent careers. The recovered masterpiece returns to its rightful place in the gallery with enhanced security measures that address the specific vulnerabilities Bramwell had exploited. The recovered masterpiece returns to its rightful place in the gallery with enhanced security measures that address the specific vulnerabilities Bramwell had exploited. However, the greater victory lies in the systematic exposure of criminal methods that had operated undetected across London's cultural institutions for years. Holmes's investigation reveals that this theft was not an isolated incident, but part of a sophisticated network that exploited the trust relationships between wealthy patrons and museum security personnel. Bramwell's arrest leads to discovery of communication records showing coordination with similar partnerships at other institutions, where desperate patrons with gambling debts had found willing accomplices among security staff who possessed the technical knowledge necessary for circumventing protective systems. The recovered artwork undergoes thorough conservation assessment to ensure no damage occurred during its brief captivity. Restorer Penn, now completely vindicated, leads this process with renewed confidence and institutional support. Her expertise confirms that the painting suffered no deterioration during its rooftop storage, testament to the criminals' sophisticated understanding of art preservation requirements that had made their deception so convincing. Dr. Watson documents the human cost of this criminal enterprise, noting how the systematic framing of innocent employees represented perhaps the most insidious aspect of the entire operation. The psychological damage inflicted on Penn and her conservation team required months of counseling and rebuilding trust within the museum community, demonstrating that financial crimes against cultural institutions carry consequences far beyond monetary loss. Patron Ainsley's gambling debts, now fully exposed, reveal a pattern of financial desperation that had made him vulnerable to criminal partnership with corrupt security personnel. His social standing provides no protection against prosecution for conspiracy and theft, while his creditors face their own legal complications for enabling the desperate circumstances that motivated cultural crimes. The museum's board implements comprehensive reforms addressing the systemic vulnerabilities that allowed this conspiracy to develop undetected. New protocols require multiple authorization levels for patron lending arrangements, while security personnel undergo enhanced background screening that includes financial stability assessment and psychological evaluation for positions involving access to valuable cultural assets. Holmes's investigation methodology becomes a model for cultural institutions throughout London and beyond, demonstrating how sophisticated criminal partnerships exploit the intersection of social privilege and institutional access. His emphasis on following seemingly insignificant physical evidence, rather than accepting convenient suspects, prevents the destruction of innocent careers while exposing truly guilty parties. The gala exhibition proceeds as scheduled, with distinguished visitors viewing The Madonna of Sorrows in its proper setting while learning about the detective work that ensured its recovery. The story becomes a celebrated example of how methodical investigation and logical deduction can triumph over sophisticated criminal planning when applied with sufficient patience and precision. Curator Harrow emerges from the crisis with enhanced leadership credibility, having demonstrated commitment to thorough investigation despite tremendous institutional pressure for quick resolution. Her willingness to support Holmes's methodical approach, even when it contradicted convenient explanations, establishes new standards for cultural institution management during security crises. The resolution provides closure not only for the immediate theft, but for the broader pattern of institutional vulnerability that had allowed criminal partnerships to operate undetected across London's museum community. Enhanced communication between institutions creates networks for sharing security intelligence and preventing similar criminal enterprises from exploiting trust relationships in the future. As morning light illuminates the recovered masterpiece in its gallery setting, Holmes reflects on how the smallest details, a piece of ordinary chewing gum, can unlock the most extraordinary mysteries when examined with sufficient care and logical precision. The case demonstrates that criminal sophistication, however elaborate, ultimately cannot withstand methodical investigation guided by scientific observation and unwavering commitment to truth over convenience. The investigation concludes with justice served, institutions strengthened, and innocent parties vindicated, a testament to the power of logical deduction applied with both intellectual rigor and human compassion.